Let's turn our attention back to the secret Morrison ministerial portfolios. With me is Professor George Williams, an expert in constitutional law from the University of New South Wales. Professor, thank you for your time as always. Is all of this legal, what went on under the Morrison government?
Well, I think it's likely to be legal because there are so few rules that apply to something like this. The Constitution in section 64 says that the Governor-General must appoint ministers, but the Governor-General has made a statement indicating that happened. Beyond that, things like transparency and other matters are for convention and common sense. So I think here it's unlikely there's been a legal breach. We'll need to know more for sure, but it's more likely questions will arise about, is this wise, was it sensible, and why were we not told?
So when you talk about is it wise, sensible, and the lack of transparency, in your mind, does it undermine the way our Westminster system is meant to work?
Well, yes, it does. And the very basic reason it does is because the ministry is kept in check by Parliament. I mean, that's the heart of our system of responsible government. And that only works if Parliament knows who the ministers are. And if you take, for example, the pandemic powers that Greg Hunt could exercise, the most extraordinary powers on the statute book, the fact that a second person could exercise those powers is highly significant for Parliament, for it to exercise its role of vigilance and knowing what's going on. So the absence of transparency is really a fundamental flaw in the working of that system.
Have you seen anything like a precedent in the face of a crisis like the pandemic where some other portfolios were taken on? This scenario obviously went further than that, like we saw with the PEP 11 gas exploration licence. That wasn't obviously related to the pandemic, but from your reading of our history, is this unprecedented?
Well, I'm certainly not aware of another example, but then again, perhaps if it occurred in secret, we may not be. But I think that's unlikely. But if we go to other points of crisis, World War I, World War II, I'm not aware of suggestions there that the Prime Minister took on the Defence Minister's portfolio, for example, and so you had dual exercise. And the reason you wouldn't expect to have happened is it's just not a sensible thing to do. Cabinet depends upon trust. It depends upon clear lines of authority and accountability. And this, of course, blurs those lines and threatens to set up a situation where in the midst of a pandemic or crisis, you may actually have contradictory decisions and therefore legal uncertainty about who's in charge, who is actually directing the pandemic response. So it's not a very sensible emergency response anyway. And if you're really worried about incapacity or making sure there's a backstop, there are other good ways of doing that. And in fact, the law already provides for acting ministers and the like. So for me, the big question is, why would you do this? It just doesn't make much sense from the perspective of good governance.
Do you see the argument that the former Prime Minister makes, essentially in his statement today, that the powers were largely dormant, so they were really a backup option if those on the front line of the ministerial responsibility got sick or were taken out for some reason?
Dormant, yes, unless, of course, the Prime Minister decided to exercise them, as he did in the resources area. But I mean, they are dormant, and perhaps, apart from that, perhaps that has reduced the impact, but we'll see. I mean, there may be more to come out here as well. Yesterday, we thought there were 3 portfolios. Today, there are 5, and we need more information. But the fact it's dormant isn't enough of an explanation in any event. Particularly when you are dealing with those pandemic powers, it is also about public trust and confidence. And when there was so much concern in the community about secrecy in government, decisions occurring behind closed doors, something like this really cuts across public trust. And again, for Parliament, even if it's dormant, Parliament needs to know who might exercise these powers, because it goes to the heart of how Cabinet operates, the relationship between the Prime Minister and ministers. And of course, the ministers themselves need to know. And that, in many ways, is the biggest surprise of all. And this just blindsided people in a way that perhaps we've escaped a worse consequence. But that's fortunate, given it could have turned out much worse.
Professor George Williams from the University of New South Wales, thank you for your analysis.